Hello, everybody. Good morning. Thank you for joining us. It's great to see so many of you on here. Our goal today is explaining the Americans with Disabilities Act, its requirements, as well as how those affect your designs and installations of your drinking fountains, bottle fillers. We'll cover touchless a little bit and things like that too. So keep in mind as I move through the presentation that the requirements that I'm covering apply to a lot more than just drinking fountains, a lot more than just drinking fountains, as well as the fact that all of you have state, local laws to adhere to. So ensure that those are being taken into consideration as well. State and local standards have to be more strict than what's currently in place at the federal level. Which is what we're going to cover today, the federal standard. So to get moving here, let's go. My name is Justin Dunn. I am the product specialist and trainer for Haws. With me running everything behind the scenes here is Nicole Dennison. She is our marketing manager here at Haws. Both of us are working remotely, so if you hear any funny sounds in the background, it's one of the creatures that lives in our homes, either dogs or children. So if you'll be patient with us if you hear anything like that, we'd appreciate it. Moving on, post questions at any time. All attendees are going to be on mute for the presentation, but once the presentation is complete, I'm going to go through submitted questions, answer those as best as I can, and go through some questions that were submitted during the presentation. So feel free to submit questions at any time during the webinar by using the questions section on the control panel. All questions, if not answered during the Q&A, I'll answer those in a follow-up email on an Excel spreadsheet so that you can keep that, do what you want with it, but that'll all be post-webinar. We will also be launching poll questions throughout the webinar, and Nicole and I really greatly appreciate your participation in that. That helps us to continue to improve this webinar for you. So a follow-up email I mentioned earlier is going to be sent out within about 24 to 48 hours after the presentation. Usually there's quite a few questions during the presentation, so plan on 48 hours. So I have plenty of time to answer those, make it look good, and then we'll shoot everything off to you. But that email will include the on-demand recording, presentation slides, additional support materials, and CEU instructions too. So this is accredited with the ASPE, AIA, and ABIH. And instructions will be in the follow-up email for each of those and how to get those credits if you're trying to squeeze them in before the end of the year. So just to give you probably my favorite part, the little history lesson I like to throw in at the beginning. Our founder is Luther Haws. He invented the modern drinking fountain in 1906, and he formed the Haws Sanitary Drinking Fountain Company in 1909 in Berkeley, California. And given our history with hydration, innovation, we really think that we're pretty uniquely situated to cover this type of information for you. And we do hope that you enjoy it. Luther was actually working as a sanitation inspector for Berkeley when he had the thought to invent a device that would prevent users from putting their mouth on the device that was being used to take a drink. Now, public fountains before the first bubbler head were typically a constantly running fountain, which isn't that uncommon in the rest of the world. Or like a spigot that sometimes had a cup attached to it via a chain. You would fill it, take a drink, drop the cup, and I don't think I need to explain why that's an issue. And lucky for us, Luther put his mind to task and he created a solution and to solve this problem and greatly improved public sanitation going forward. Now today, Haas is located in Sparks, Nevada. We're going on 112 years young and still working hard to improve the health and safety of our global community. Our topics today are going to include the overview of the ADA legislation, common ADA installation issues, ADA compliant drinking fountain and bottle filler installations. We've also peppered our new touchless equipment throughout the presentation, and I'll cover how touchless is affected by these requirements as well. We'll go through a frequently asked questions section and then do a quick overview of the electric water cooler, the 1200 series, which is a great new tool for touchless innovation and for providing chilled drinking water. Moving on, before we really get into it, we're going to start with poll question number 1 and get this out of the way. Nicole, if you would, please.
Sure, thanks, Justin. So what is your role when it comes to drinking fountains? If this does not apply to you, please just ignore. We'll give it just a few seconds here. Answers are still coming in, so I'll give everybody just a quick second to finish. And while you're filling in this poll, again, if you have any questions throughout this presentation, please feel free to message me directly and I will try to answer them, or submit to Justin for follow-up at the end or post-webinar. I'm going to go ahead and close this poll. Thanks, guys.
Yes, thank you everybody for participating in that. It's really helpful for us. So before I start throwing numbers at you, first and foremost, I always like to remind everybody that the 2010 ADA standards are civil rights legislation, and that prior to the standard and its inception, accessibility was non-existent. There were very few accommodations being made for those with accessibility needs. There weren't any teeth in the requirements to provide access to buildings and grounds for an entire class of people, and they were being very heavily neglected. But thanks to people like Justin Dart, founder of Dart Industries, and George H.W. Bush, who was the sitting president that signed the Americans with Disabilities Act into law on July 26, 1990, which granted reasonable accommodations to people with disabilities, and it prohibited discrimination based on those people's disabilities. It's actually a really cool story, and it's hard to believe today that people that had disabilities were met with such resistance. There were protests, there were counter protests. They even had demonstrations like Capitol Crawl, where about 60 demonstrators, they abandoned their wheelchairs and they crawled up the steps of the Capitol to show its inaccessibility. And once they reached the top, demanded to reach the Speaker of the House. In other instances, actually one of my favorite stories was while protesting the Transportation Association, a group of protesters the police showed up to arrest the protesters, and in a really funny and ironic twist that I'm sure helped the cause, they didn't have an accessible paddy wagons, and they had to obtain accessible school buses to transport the protesters to jail that day. But and of course there were counter protests. There were people that were upset that, thinking that it wasn't their fault that these people are going through this, and they didn't want to invest the money to update their buildings and the accessibility to it. But all of that changed pretty quickly afterwards. Okay, so actually I was saying here, with all that said, the Americans with Disabilities Act, Act 28, CFR Part 36, Title 3, regarding public accommodations and commercial facilities and its requirements, they're enforced by none other than the Department of Justice. Title 3 is going to be our focus today. The following are all key sections of that standard pertaining to drinking fountains and their compliance. And also remember that Nicole is going to send out this information afterwards to everyone, so you can reference them later. So don't worry about furious note taking and things like that. And quickly, since I always get asked this, it happens every time, Title II covers state and local government. Title I has more to do with anti-discrimination of disabled employees. So, but Title III is what we're covering today. Those could be their own webinars in time it would take for me to cover those. So I like to start talking about section 36.403 is usually my starting point, which gives us a list of priorities when making alterations to provide accessibility in a facility. And you're going to notice that in this list, drinking fountains take a pretty high priority, even over accessible parking. The entrance, the route, the restrooms, public telephones, fountains, as well as parking, storage, and alarms are all high priority items, basic human necessities when navigating the world. And if there's one thing we can all agree on, all walks of life, all people, everywhere need water. That's right at the top of the list of things we need to survive and need to ensure that it's accessible to everybody. We're not making it more difficult for an entire class of people to just to get a drink. So Chapter 1, Section 102 of the standard lets us know that this document contains both adult and children's requirements based on average human anthropometrics. So children are defined as age 12 or younger in the ADA. I've got examples later on in the presentation for both adult and children's heights installations and issues with those installations. So we'll cover all of that coming up here. This section, Chapter 2 under scoping requirements, 211, explains that there are, where there is one fountain, typically a high side fountain, that there must be 2 fountains installed. Local building codes determine the number of drinking fountains that have to be installed based on occupancy. This simply states that there has to be a high fountain and there has to be a low fountain. What many people don't understand is that the low side fountain is not the only one that's designed for people with disabilities. People frequently forget this. The high side fountain is also a disabled accessible fountain and is designed for those with bending and stooping disabilities. People that might be using a walker, cane, crutches, and may not be physically able to utilize the low side fountain. So other than aesthetics, drinking fountains are not designed for able-bodied people. It's reasonable to assume that if you are able-bodied, that you can take a drink of whatever fountain you decide you want to take a drink from. You're perfectly capable of that. But the high side and low side drinking fountains were both designed for people that would have difficult accessing a drink of water. So if you're installing a single fountain in your facility or in a park, you have to satisfy this ADA requirement and install a second drinking fountain. They don't even need to be next to each other. They can be separated. They could be on different ends of a building, of a hallway, different bathrooms. It doesn't matter, but you have to have one of each. Moving on to 11.3. This is referred to as, we call this the 50-50 rule. And all that it says is that half of the units installed need to be high fountains, the other half need to be low fountains. So for example, if you're installing 6 fountains, you wouldn't be able to do 4 high fountains and only 2 low fountains. That would be unfair. You'd have to do 3 high and then 3 low, 50-50. So the exception to this rule is where the number of fountains yields a fraction. So if you were installing 7 fountains, you would have to do 3 high and 3 low. The very last fountain, that odd number, it'd be entirely up to you whether that's going to be a high or low fountain. So long as you're meeting the minimum number of fountains designated by local plumbing code, and how many and what your occupancy load is. Chapter 3, under building blocks, we start getting into dimensional and mechanical elements. You're going to hear me use the term elements a whole lot. And an element can be any device that we're granting access to. It can be a fire extinguisher, a phone, drinking fountain, baby changing table. There are so many different things that we could be referring to. And they have their own respective sections too, if you needed to know specifics about some bathroom fixtures or railing, etc. They have their own respective sections. Today, we're really just focusing on the drinking fountain section, but many of the measurements apply to all of those elements, not just drinking fountains. This is one of the most important measurements to remember, and very frequently the section that's being violated when you see tear outs, reinstalls, and you've got to invest a little bit extra into it to get it back into compliance. So 305.3, 305.4, or 5 detail clear ground space to accommodate the wheelchair underneath the fountain. So this allows for an approach that's unobstructed to that fountain. So you have to provide a 30 by 48 inch measurement of clearance underneath the element, whatever that element is. In this example, of course, we're using we'll be using a drinking fountain, but that could be any number of things. So this gives the user clear space for the wheelchair and for their hands to maneuver into that space too. We don't want to make it too narrow, especially if it's in an alcove or something like that, which I'll cover here in a couple slides. So here, this is a really great demonstration of the clear ground space in front of an element. In this case, we have a telephone and a fire extinguisher, and 305.5 explains that the positioning of this clear ground space, allowing for either a forward approach like the one you see on the left or a parallel approach, as you see on the right, is you could do either or. It doesn't matter what you do, so long as you have the space to do it. And I'll explain that here on the next slide, I believe. Yeah, here we go. So the maneuvering clearance that we're providing access to, right? So keep in mind the 30 by 48 inches going forward. It's very frequently, again, the cause of those poor installations and the compliance issues that you end up seeing. Remember also that these are minimum requirements. The more space that you can provide, the better, right? Now, when an element's in an alcove, like in these examples, and I just mentioned, wheelchair users are going to need additional space to maneuver, right? I hope that makes sense to everybody. I mean, you have your hands are operating the wheels, you have to maneuver in and out, and we want that to be as easy as possible. So in this first example here, if an alcove is in place, our 30 by 48 inches becomes 36 by 48 inches anytime the depth of that alcove exceeds 24 inches. So if it's deeper than 2 feet, we've got to start expanding our alcove to allow additional space for maneuverability. In the second, for a parallel approach, when the depth of the alcove exceeds 15 inches, then our clear floor space needs to be 30 by 60 inches. Obviously much longer. If you're going to get a parallel approach into an alcove, you really need extra room to get that the side of your wheelchair as close up to the element as possible, right? So currently only a few states that I'm aware of require the use of alcoves. California and Texas being the two biggest. Many other states are starting to follow suit, and it just makes sense for elements to be out of the path of travel, and it gives somebody a little bit more privacy depending on what type of element it is that you're using. puts these elements out of the way and makes these areas a lot more accessible for another class of disabled person, which is the seeing impaired. But more on that here shortly. So toe and knee clearance. So extending up from our clear ground space is this three-dimensional space that you need to think about underneath the drinking fountain. So try to think of this clear area as a three-dimensional space that you have to keep clear. Okay, so our toe clearance is 9 inches from the ground to the bottom of the element, and our knee clearance is 27 inches from the ground up to the bottom of the front of the fountain. So if you use that as well as our clear ground space that I provided earlier, you start to see, like in the image here, that three-dimensional space that we need to keep completely clear of obstructions. And before you ask, nothing in between the victim's knees too. So I get that question a lot, but that counts as an obstruction too. So P-traps, hanging phone books, anything else, that's not a space that you're allowed to use. But I like that because that particular illustration, because I think it really demonstrates that very well. So Nicole, if you would launch poll question number 2, please, before we move on.
Thanks. Which brands do you specify most or have in your facility? Again, if this does not apply to you, please just leave it blank. I'll give you guys just a second or two more to fill in these answers. We'll go ahead and close it out. Thanks.
All right, thank you, everybody. So on to protruding objects. And I've got one of my favorite illustrations coming up next that really helps to drive this home. But 307 is primarily in place to protect another type of protected class that I just mentioned, that we haven't really touched on, is the vision impaired. And elements can only protrude into a walkway so much and need to be located at certain heights, whether they're in an alcove or not. And that's primarily to prevent anyone in the walkway from running into those elements. So objects with their leading edge, the lowest point on the front of the element, above 27 inches may only protrude a maximum of 4 inches into the path of travel. But so long as the leading edge of the element is at or under 27 inches, then this is considered to be detectable by a detection cane, according to the Department of Justice. So here's that illustration I just mentioned. Again, it's one of my favorite illustrations that I've stolen, and I like to take credit for. On the bottom right, we see an object very similar to a drinking fountain. And so long as this object's leading edge is at or below that 27-inch line that you see there, it can be detected through the use of a detection cane early enough to be avoided and prevent potential injury and disorientation. So this fountain and any elements, so long as it's meeting the 27-inch requirement, can protrude any amount into this space. It doesn't matter. It's considered detectable. So the same rule applies for elements at or above 80 inches from the floor. So this is considered headroom clearance, and similar to the previous example, it can extend any amount into this space. If you're taller than 6 foot 8 inches, then I'm sorry, you're gonna have some objects to avoid, but people don't generally take advantage of that space. Obviously, you don't want anybody hitting their head and running into them. But it's all based on average human measurements. On the left, we have an object sitting above 27 inches and is below 80 inches. and as such is not above headroom clearance, and it can't be detected by a cane. So therefore, those objects can't protrude into a space any more than 4 inches, unless it's a handrail. Handrails are allowed to protrude 4.5 inches. But if you think about how a fire extinguisher is stored, sometimes they protrude a little bit from the wall. They have to be under 4 inches and things like that, which is why you have a lot of recessed objects within that particular range in a hallway or et cetera, a room. So for this example, I'm going to use the 1011 HPS. This is our high polished steel and our SK3 cane skirt. This is a high-low dual unit, typically installed in high traffic customer facing type areas, mostly due to that mirror finish that's on there. And it's a great example of what your typical high-low ADA installation looks like. The SK3, the cane skirt, it's what we are going to focus on here, where drinking fountains can't be alcoved out of the path of travel. You have to have a cane skirt used to lower the leading edge of that high side fountain to 27 inches to also make that side detectable, right? Because you could be coming from either direction. So when you're using a detection cane, certainly if you're unassisted, you're generally following what's referred to as a shoreline or outermost edge of a space. So since the visually impaired may need to detect something on either side of the room, they may be traveling in a direction, and without the cane skirt in place, there will likely be incidents where people are going to run into the high side fountain or have a difficult time finding it or detecting it, which is why we use that cane skirt. Many states still don't fully utilize alcoves. And until they do, cane skirts are the device that we need to be using to make this one. Nicole, is that you reorganizing the shelves over there?
I am sorry, I can't. I do this every webinar. I start typing away and I forget that I'm not muted. I apologize.
I was like, where is that coming from? Okay, next we're going to talk about reach ranges. So section 308 in the standard covers our reach ranges. Another important requirement when something like a bottle filler is installed, or when things like a baby changing station is installed. The slide's pretty straightforward. If your reach is unobstructed, like in the photo on the left here, then you have a 48-inch max and 15-inch minimum reach range. Any buttons, handles, sensors being important right now since we have all this hands-free, hands-off technology available to us and that Haas is providing now and is becoming increasingly popular due to the pandemic. Any of those have to be located within that range. But as soon as we introduce an obstruction into that space, our reach ranges start to diminish, right? So when an object is shorter than 20 inches and it's in place, we keep our 48-inch high reach range, but our lower reach range disappears, right? If you're thinking about the logistics of it and you're in a wheelchair and you have that object sticking out, you're not going to be able to reach down under it without maneuvering into a pretty uncomfortable position. So when reaching over an object that is 20 to 25 inches, our high reach range is shortened to only 44 inches. So generally speaking, drinking fountains are shorter than 20 inches. So the middle example will be really what our reach ranges are going to be for a drinking fountain and say bottle filler combination, usually. Remember, we want to make sure things are as easy as possible and not create a challenge for the disabled person. And not all drinking fountains are created equally. Here at Haas, we really try to stick to that 20-inch max. That's not true for everybody. There are drinking fountains that exceed that 20-inch max out there. certainly older ones that exceed that. So when you're measuring, just remember they're not all created equally, and it does change based on brand. Moving on, this slide, okay, so in 11B, 308.1, this is an advisory from the DOJ, and it defines reach ranges for children based on age. So remember, children are defined as ages 12 and under in the ADA. These reach ranges apply to both forward and parallel approach to an element. So starting on the left, ages 3 and 4, you have a 36 high, 20-inch low reach range, ages 5 to 8, 40 to 18, and 9 to 12, 44 to 16. So ages over 12 are expected to utilize adult height drinking fountains. Under the age of 12, it's more likely that you're going to have an adult to assist you. So, and the only places you'll typically find these in use is in the school system, daycare facilities, and similar facilities to those where many children are supervised by fewer adults, right? And in public, the expectation is that, again, you have an adult that is going to be present and assist you with getting a drink at a normal drinking fountain, a regular adult size drinking fountain, which is why you see so few child height drinking fountains. Another good example would be parks. You have lots of parks where, you know, children are semi-supervised, they're running around, they're having a great time, and you know, may want to grab a drink and can do so without adult supervision. Okay, plumbing elements and their facilities. In Chapter 6, we get into specifics regarding plumbing elements and their measurements. This particular section, and not just my opinion, is one of the more poorly written sections, but I'll kind of go into that. But first off, 602.2 covers clear floor space and the necessity to have that clear floor space centered on the unit, which is incredibly important, not the alcove centered on the equipment that is in the alcove. So I have some examples of installations that missed this mark that are coming up, but this is for a forward approach, as a parallel approach needs to be set up different. Obviously, our toe and knee clearance need to also be available in this situation. So there is an exception included here for parallel approaches to children's use units. Knee and toe clearance begins to diminish pretty quickly as we lower fountains for children's use. So the use of a parallel approach is incredibly important, especially considering that children's wheelchairs are very frequently adult-sized wheelchairs. Custom-sized wheelchairs for children they can be expensive, and kids quickly outgrow them. So it's not sometimes the best option for a lot of parents that are out there. So a parallel approach helps to solve that issue and allowing for that. On here, this is a pretty good example of what we just talked about. So this is showing that floor space and how they need to be centered on the elements, not on the area. So as far as the fountain goes, since the clear floor space is intended for the wheelchair user, it's centered on the left low side fountain. And since there is no real floor space defined in black and white for the high side, the floor can be, space can spill over into the high side fountain area as much as it needs to. Many make the mistake of centering the clear floor space on the alcove, and that's going to lead to expensive tear outs, redesigns, reinstalls, because that's just not giving anybody enough space. If you try to think about it, and that yellow space centered on the low side fountain being squished into the middle, centered on the drinking fountain, you know, giving maybe somebody the idea that that this alcove can be shortened, then you're not going to have enough space there on the left-hand side. So here, let me try to really break this down for you. So here we can have a total width of 48 inches in this alcove. It's not deeper than 24 inches, so we don't need to expand on our 30-inch floor space width. You will, however, notice that it shows a separate measurement for California. In classical fashion, California strayed from the standard requirements and mandated an additional 2 inches of floor space, bumping up the width of the floor space to 32 inches. So, so long as state requirements go above and beyond the federal standards, they can supersede them. So that's what happens in California. So to center the fountain in the alcove correctly, which is not mandatory, by the way, but is typically done so that it aesthetically looks pleasing in that space, we would need 28 inches total width of the alcove in California, and 46 elsewhere. If the alcove was deeper than 24 inches, remember that we would need a total of 36 inches of ground clearance, centered on the low side unit. So center line to center line, these fountains are separated by about 16 inches, which means we need an additional 18 inches of space on either side total to meet our 36-inch minimum and for the fountain to be centered. But remember, it's not required that it's centered. If you really had to, and you didn't have enough space to meet your clear floor space for that low side fountain, you could shove the whole fountain over. Again, there's no clear ground space that's required for that high side fountain. So since there's no obstructions under the high side fountain, our primary concern is it's that wall. It's always the wall. Remember, if it's at all intruding into our floor space, the alcove would need to be redesigned, or the fountain needs to be, again, shoved over so that the high side is closer to the alcove wall, giving us clear floor space centered on that low side fountain. The fountain might be a little off center, but whatever. We should remember that the high side is also for those with disabilities. So while shoving it over next to that wall sounds like a quick fix or an easy way to, you know, fix this, do remember that those people are using walkers and crutches and canes, and it might not be the easiest to access a high side drinking fountain that's just shoved up against the wall on the other side to make room for the other. So, and to be fair, there is an agreed upon number for the high side floor clearance that I'll cover later. It's not in black and white. It's just a general number that a lot of us throw around, because when you think about the use of a cane or a walker, you need a certain amount of space to provide clearance for those types of devices. But I'll cover that here in a second. Nicole, poll question number 3, if you would, please.
Okay. What is the most important benefit to you or your clients when selecting drinking fountains? Okay, lots of responses coming in, so I'll give it just a few more seconds. We've had some good comments and questions come through. That's why you could hear me feverishly typing away. I will make sure to mute myself moving forward. Right. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and close it down.
Awesome, thank you, Nicole, and thank you everybody for participating. So this is an excerpt from California Building Code, and what they have done, along with Texas and a few other states, Georgia, Connecticut, is they've made it mandatory to locate all drinking fountains in alcoves or within wing walls to ensure that they don't impede into pedestrian walkways. So these protected areas need to be 32 inches wide and 18 inches deep minimum. Wing walls act like an alcove where an alcove can't be installed. or is retrofitted into place to move to make it more detectable, especially when it's in a walkway outdoors in a park, and is usually where you see wing walls. The wing walls must also project horizontally at least as far as the drinking fountain. So, and while we're on the topic of chapter 6 here, I should bring up that the flow of water must also be within compliance from the equipment. So the height of the stream of water must be at least 4 inches to allow for a bottle or glass to be filled for those who may be incapable of leaning over to drink. It also makes it a lot easier for someone to take a drink. So, and what you see here, and I've got a few examples, but that valve in the very front of the drinking fountain there, that's our 5874 valve. And the little hole there in the front of that push button is actually where you adjust the stream up and down. If you have a Haas drinking fountain, if you plan on getting a Haas drinking fountain, that's how it's adjusted. You just need a small flathead, you stick it in there, and you can adjust the stream up and down very quickly, which this process is not the easiest across all brands. And the issue in this photo is probably pretty obvious, right? So alcoves are typically the issue when we see non-compliance, or what's referred to as a drive-by lawsuit. In this installation, we see that the low side is installed on the right, and we have what I'm told is a large gas line obstructing our toe and knee clearance underneath the fountain. So this could be fixed real easily just by swapping the two fountains so that the clear floor space on the left is being utilized for the low side fountain. So long as there's 30 inches or 32 for California between the gas line and the wall on the left, and whatever that other little valve drain is, then we could be compliant, back into compliance pretty quickly and easily there. Here's another one. This one shows a high-low configuration. They're using 4-inch tile behind the fountains. We can see that the center line of the low side to the wall that we have only 14 inches, giving us only 29 inches of clearance. But that's enough to make this a difficult approach. If you've never used a wheelchair, I can tell you that it's fairly difficult if you're not experienced. If you are experienced, I'm sure you could find a way to squeeze in there, but we don't need to make it more difficult than it needs to be, right? So they may not have considered the thickness of the tile maybe when they finished the alcove. And again, they could move those over to bring them back into compliance. The high side not having clearance concerns could just be moved over closer to the wall to help fix this. Unless they want them centered too, then they'll need to redesign the alcove, which is it's costly. So people, school districts, governments are wary and typically diligent when ensuring the details are correct, because they know litigation is real and it can be very expensive. Okay, over to children's use for a moment. Section 602.2 gives us the maximum bubbler height of 30 inches and a 3.5-inch maximum depth for the bubbler from the front edge of the fountain. This also allows us to forego our previously mentioned knee and toe clearance, so we can lower the fountain where the users are intended to be children. So there will need to be a parallel approach and parallel space for that available though. Here's another example. So much wrong in this photo. Their intention was good, and they wanted to install a high-low fountain with a third child height fountain in a cascading design, but it's all mixed up and backwards and terrible. It's good looking fountains though. I like those fountains. But firstly, our clear floor space and knee clearance is being obstructed by what they intended to be the child fountain on the left, and what should have been the ADA fountain since it's got the longer arm on it. Now, not only is the fountain way too short for our knees and our toes to fit under, but a wheelchair is going to have trouble maneuvering to the fountain bubbler while your knees or wheelchair are hitting the side fountain. The high-low combo unit on the left should have been installed on the right, with the single fountain on the right installed on the left, with enough room in between it and the center fountain to meet our 30 inches of clear floor space. And I'll show you how that's done right now. I'm going to use our 1311 and our 1501 for this example. These are enameled cast iron fountains you typically see in schools and medical facilities and stuff. They always remind me of school. Here is basically the mirror image of the example I just showed you earlier, but compliant. The 1311 high-low unit is installed on the left as the standing and ADA fountain, with the 22 inches between the center line of the center fountain and the child height fountain, giving us plenty of room for our clear floor space. Here you can see the outline of the 30 inches of space we need. The high side fountain doesn't offer any obstructions, so we just need to ensure the child fountain is far enough away that it doesn't interfere with the wheelchair. Our clear floor space is a three-dimensional space. Really, it's a 30 by 48 by 27 inch high space under the wheelchair accessible fountain. So center line to center line, we'd be 23 inches if we need to bump up our floor space to 32 inches for California, over the child bowl, that is. So if you didn't care about the cascading design too of the fountains, you could even take the child height fountain and place it on the left side of this design. Then you would only need to ensure the wall to the right of the ADA fountain was far enough away. But the child fountain could be placed closer to the standing fountain on the left, saving some space for that alcove too, and not taking up so much, since you don't have to consider that the distance between the center fountain and the child height fountain. A couple outdoor examples. This is our 3300 FR. This one's an easy example. I'm sure you're spotting it right away. It's just way too close to that wall and needs to be moved away immediately. Someone's feeling thirsty, probably. Here's another example for outdoor compliance. This fountain, for example, has an adjustable arm. It can be adjusted for either adult ADA or a child height arm. These are incredibly common in parks. You've probably seen them before, especially because of their ability to accommodate both ADA and children height with that arm. When installing these fountains, considering the approach and considering the direction of the bubbler head are very important factors when trying to ensure compliance for your installation. So think about which way that's going to be facing before you design this, before you install it, and if you have one installed, you'll want to consider this. Alrighty, each of the following examples that I'm going to go over are compliant. Above, we have our 3150. If the 3150 or any other outdoor fountain is installed against a wall, building, or railing structure, or whatever it is, the center line of the wheelchair accessible fountain needs to be a minimum of 15 inches from that wall to give us our 30 by 48 inch clear space out from the base of the fountain, allowing for easy access to the fountain. Hopefully nobody's surprised by this, but it doesn't take a lot to make it difficult to utilize a drinking fountain or other element if this is done incorrectly. So same as indoor installations, we need to have our available knee space, toe clearance available under the fountain as well. Lastly, I mentioned this earlier in the presentation, you can see it on there, but on the bottom middle is our visual representation of the clear floor space for the high side fountain of 30 inches by 30 inches. Again, this is not required, but it is generally agreed upon and necessary for accessibility. And since it's intended for those with stooping and bending disabilities, we need to assume that walkers or other devices are being used and then that they're going to need a certain amount of space to use them correctly. So again, not required, but that's the general agreed upon space where you could fit any of those devices in and they'd be able to access the device. So common practice in public parks is to usually to pour a pad of concrete specifically for the fountain and to help remove the fountain from the pedestrian walkway and give users a firm surface to stand on, or the wheelchair users a firm surface for the wheels to avoid difficulty that dirt or grass would provide for access. In this example, you can clearly see the path of travel on the left side, which will provide easy access to the low side fountain. If the orientation of the fountain were any different in this exact layout, access to the fountain would be very difficult. And to fit the fountain perfectly here, to include both the wheelchair free ground space and the high side fountain space, we need a pad that is 69 inches by 52 inches deep and wide, with the low side facing the path of travel for the easiest way to approach this. So a different example this time with wing walls or guardrails in place. But the general positioning and installation idea remains the same. Path of travel is on the left, and you've got the fencing towards the back of the fountain. So, and we're meeting all our clear ground space here. Just prioritize the approach to that wheelchair accessible fountain is the main idea here. We make a whole bunch of models. This is to accommodate this. This is just a short lineup of some of the models that Haas offers to make compliant installation possible. Just to give you a little preview there. My favorite being the second from the right there. Anything that incorporates a drinking fountain for my dogs is the coolest thing that's ever been invented. That's my favorite. So for those who may not be aware, the 2010 ADA standards for accessible design was derived from an ANSI standard, and that ANSI standard was A117.1 -2009. The updates that these standards last received included the addition of bottle filling stations to the drinking fountains. Section 602, as you see on the screen. Remember this, in addition, a bottle filler doesn't replace a fountain ever. Not everyone has a cup or a bottle to utilize a bottle filler, and drinking fountains are very important for that reason. So you cannot replace a drinking fountain with a bottle filler ever. 602.4 just indicates that bottle fillers must adhere to basically the clear floor space and of 30 by 48 inches that we covered earlier, and that the controls need to be either hand operated or automatic and be within our reach ranges. So they can be manual or they can be fully sensor operated, but they have to meet our reach ranges in the same fashion that our push buttons did. There's also an exception on this page saying that if the bottle filler is installed on both the high and low side fountains, then the high side fountain does not need to comply with this section, which is due to the fact that our low side bottle filler is accessibly installed. It's pretty rare to see an installation like that, though. You usually don't have both a bottle filler on the high side and on the low side, but the low side has to be prioritized when installing that bottle filler so that it's accessible. Okay. Next up, I'm going to use our 1920 bottle filler for the next few examples. We've got our new sensors on the 1920 there. It's a nice little close-up preview of those. Our new hands-off technology, very cool. Okay, so if anybody remembers the product plug from earlier, this is the 1117 LN. With our 1920 bottle filler over the low side fountain, accessible to all, well within our reach ranges. And all we need to ensure here is that the button on the front there is reachable or the activator is reachable. And again, it can be either hand operated or automatic. It doesn't matter either way. All they're trying to avoid with this verbiage is like foot, knee, or other body part activation, whatever it happens to be. Parts of the body that would be difficult to use for those in a wheelchair. So this needs to be as easy as possible. So, which is why they stuck to that particular verbiage. And even with all that said, I'm sure the standard will change eventually. We could still do a much better job. It's easy for us, and we need to make sure it's easy for others as well. In accordance with 308.2.2, our reach ranges, the activation for the bottle filler is located at 46 inches, which is below the required 48 inches we covered earlier. Remember, this is a maximum height. And since it's a maximum height, the activator can be located anywhere between the fountain and the bottle filler. It doesn't have to be at 46 inches. So just not below the fountain, right? Because we have an obstruction in the way, we can't activate it that way. Since we have an obstruction to our low reach range, right? So if there was no fountain installed or no obstruction under the bottle filler, we could install the activator as low as 15 inches. Based on our reach ranges, but that would also be pretty impractical, and you'd have to balance the bottle on the back of your head and do it at the same time, and that's pretty unreasonable. The great thing about these sensor operated equipment is if you think about being in a wheelchair and what it takes for you to have the ability to push a button that's on the front of the fountain and lean over your hand now, the button and the drinking fountain to get a drink, sensor operation is fantastic in comparison, in that you just approach the fountain, lean over, and you don't have to worry about your hands, your appendages in the way of you getting a drink of water. It doesn't extend the distance between you and the bubbler head. So you just approach, your body activates the drinking fountain, you can lean over and get a drink. And I think that's pretty amazing. I think that's excellent. One of the reasons why I really love seeing hands-off technology in place. Here's another common installation, model 1501. This one mostly popular with schools due to its white enamel surface, which is intended to stay cooler, if you were wondering what the benefits were. It just helps to prevent kids from burning themselves on hot stainless steel that's been sitting in the sun. It's especially ideal for outdoor wall-mounted ADA configurations, since the fountain is often used to support the person getting a drink from a wheelchair. I figure the more compliant installations I show everyone, the more likely we are to catch misses in public. And there are more awful and interesting ones out there. So hopefully with this information, you go forth and you're able to kind of catch your own instances of non-compliance in public. Here we just have a single 1311 fountain. This could easily be used as our third child height fountain or as a standalone ADA fountain. And guess what? It could also be the high side fountain. Just depends on your facility, what their needs are, and what they're trying to fill. Speaking of child height, remember, children are defined, again, 12 and under. Here we're utilizing the age range of 9 to 12. So our reach range maximum would be 44 inches. The bubbler head has to be at a maximum of 30 inches or below for a child height fountain at the spout. So not the top of the bubbler head. Remember that, at the spout. As you can see on the screen, our bottle filler activation is at 42 5/8 from the floor, well below our 44-inch maximum, and the bubbler is at 30 inches within compliance. But with 24 inches below the fountain, again, approach can be difficult, but we have that parallel approach to help with that. Okay, here we're going to move on to some of the Q&A, the FAQ, all that fun stuff. I've got a list here that I'm going to start working off of. So thank you for your submissions and etc. I always like to end with this photo. This is installed right in our backyard. This is in the Reno International Airport, and it's just a really great example of a high-low fountain with a bottle filler. But I always like to show off on that with that photo before we move on. So poll question number 4, Nicole, if you would please.
All right, we're wrapping up. So as you read this, I will just let you know that we have just a few more slides. I've had some questions about bottle fillers in lieu of fountains, traditional fountains, with respects to the regulations during the pandemic. So I think if you're interested in hearing more about that, I think Justin, you'll talk through the touchless hydration solutions that we have, but also maybe you could touch on really where the regulations stand as we're dealing with this COVID situation. So I'll go ahead and close this and kick it back over to you, but hopefully you can touch on a couple of those things when you talk about our touchless solutions.
Thank you, Nicole. So moving on, these two, I'm just going to answer really, really quickly. Does everything have to be ADA accessible? Nope. There you go. But you just need to ask yourself, does my building or business have places designed for public accommodation? And if so, then you have your answer. Those have to be ADA compliant. Are children's height fixtures required by the ADA? Yes, and not just for fountains. Think about the customer, daycare, schools, and the like have mostly children, and they need to have accessible toilets, sinks, fountains, lots of other elements. So it is required by the ADA, but you don't have to have them everywhere. Again, in public, you usually have an adult to assist. Really quickly, gonna talk about this and then read off some questions. Wanted to introduce everybody, if you haven't seen it yet, this is our 1200 series electric water cooler. It's a pretty amazing piece of technology, especially given our current circumstances globally. Greatly increases sanitation at public drinking devices. It has a touchless electric sensor that allows for hands-free operation. Very quick installation. I actually did one myself, and if I can do it, I'm positive you can do it. And a professional will have this on the wall in about 30 minutes, which is pretty amazing. Some of the key features: touchless bottle sensor, again, available and not just for that piece of equipment, but touchless sensors are a huge priority for us right now. And I have some others that I'll show you here in just a second, but we've got options for just about every piece of equipment that we offer now. Limited to sometimes outdoor drinking fountains since power is limited. This comes with a 3,000 gallon filter. 100% water content is flushed, helping to prevent Legionella buildup and nasty water getting stuck inside of the system. It's designed to effortlessly retrofit over our competitors' models. Very progressive design. I don't think anybody would argue that compared to, you know, the classic electric water cooler and how dated they really do look. This is a pretty well designed, and we're very proud of our engineering team for coming out with something so incredible. Very quiet operation compared to much of our competition. Proprietary electronics. We have an enhanced LED communications and a full hidden menu touchscreen that's pretty amazing that shows up there on the panel. And then built with standard smart energy savings and capabilities. CSA certified, ADA compliant. It's a pretty amazing piece of equipment. And feel free to contact us if you have any questions or if you need more information about this unit. I'm sure Nicole will send some out in the post-webinar email. We also have in-field conversion kits for our drinking fountains now. We offer the standard equipment that will come with hands-off sensors, but we also have conversion kits now. So all of our drinking fountains use a standard 5874 push button that you see there on the front. It's the beating heart of that drinking fountain. It's an amazing piece of technology in itself. But the sensors can now retrofit those buttons. So long as you have power nearby, and we sell conversion kits to make that as easy as possible. But you can replace that button with a touchless sensor and really provide something that's hygienic and much more fitting for our global situation right now. Nicole, if you would launch poll question number 5 real quick, please. And then I've got some information for everybody, and I'm just going to go through some questions.
Okay. All right. So again, we've gone over a lot of information on our touchless products, and again, the regulations and how it applies to COVID at this current situation. So with all of that in mind, would you be interested in learning more about Haws touchless hydration products? Okay. All right, I'll go ahead and close this up. We will touch on a couple of questions, and then we will send the rest of these out in an email. Thanks everybody for your participation.
Okay, there's our contact information there on the screen. While that's up there, feel free to save whatever it is that you might want. We also have live chat on our website, get you in touch with our top-notch customer service team. But while we're doing that, I had a couple questions that were submitted I wanted to get to here. So this one, if you have a location with adults and children, so you need to provide a drinking fountain for adult standing, adult wheelchair, child standing, and child wheelchair height. How does this apply to bottle fillers? The CBC 11B is not clear on this, and how this also applies to bottle fillers. So yes, you have to have equipment available for both, but really only for children when the location is catered to or designed for children, like daycares, preschools, and parks, etc. Where it's less likely that there's going to be an adult to assist. Bottle fillers are optional. They are entirely optional. But if they are installed, they must be installed within the reach ranges covered. Remember that bottle fillers never replace a drinking fountain. And right now, especially with these touchless kits available, touchless bottle fillers that we're offering, it's really easy to keep bottle fillers and your drinking fountains functioning during this pandemic with them being entirely touchless. So, and I always encourage people to carry around a bottle filler in the first, or a bottle in the first place. But I hope that answers that question. This one, when are railings required for outdoor drinking fountains when placed outside or adjacent to an alcove? So railing is required when the equipment is in the path of travel and it needs to be removed from it. And it needs to be made detectable. So if we're trying to make that equipment detectable in public and protect it from pedestrian walkways and anybody potentially from running into it and make it detectable, then that's when we use railings for outdoor drinking fountains. They can be installed against a wall, against a building, or next to a walkway in public. But railings are the way that we use, or wing walls, whatever you want to call them, is how we make those detectable in public. What is required to prevent the drinking fountain from being considered a protruding object? Wing walls, recess, skirt, question mark. Yes, yes, and yes, pending your local requirements. Objects can't protrude any more than 4 inches into a walkway where alcoves are required. So same for handrails, where they are not required. You need to be using cane skirts to accomplish this. Is there a grandfather clause in the ADA for existing equipment? No, Failure to meet the requirements of the ADA constitutes a denial of access, which is a violation of the disabled person's civil rights. Which, now that I've said that, many confuse the safe harbor provision with a grandfather clause. So if you made modifications to comply with the 1991 standards and they were compliant at the time, before March 2012, you didn't need to make changes. But if you modified these post March 2012, then those modifications need to be in compliance with the 2010 standards. Okay. Are alcoves required everywhere? And if they aren't, can I use an alcove anyways? Alcoves are not required everywhere. And yes, you are allowed to use alcoves wherever you'd like. You'll have to check local building code, but alcoves are an excellent and very progressive way to remove elements from the walkway. They're an important part of construction nowadays, and will only continue to get more and more popular. And with that said, I'm gonna stop on the questions, but I did want to quickly address the pandemic and people's view of drinking fountains, bottle fillers, their installation, and things like that. Obviously, requirements are different kind of everywhere, based on state, local requirements, what it is that you've got going on, how severe you're being affected by this. You know, initially when this all started, you saw drinking fountains with bags over them, they were blocked off, etc. And drinking fountains are absolutely 100% required by the ADA. Do whatever you do, do not uninstall your drinking fountains and replace them with something else. You're required to have that, and it's very important that that remain there. We're all hoping we're going to get through this soon, and I hope it's over very soon. But we don't actually know the answer to that. And realistically, when we come out of this, we want you to be compliant. Things are going to have to change, and you have companies like us to rely on to help you accomplish that. You know, providing touchless innovations and new products to retrofit existing equipment. But just remember that bottle fillers don't replace drinking fountains. You have to have that drinking fountain by law. Bottle fillers are an excellent accessory to a drinking fountain, and I think it's much more likely somebody's going to use a bottle filler right now than they are a drinking fountain. But that has to be accessible and it has to be functioning. Just, I would say, focus on touchless options as best you can. So with that being said, thank you. I appreciate you attending. I hope you enjoyed this. I hope this was good information for you, for your colleagues, and that you use this to go forward and do good. So thank you for attending. Please use the information on the screen, and we'll be holding another safety webinar in a couple months if you want to attend. Thank you for attending. We appreciate it. Have a great day and an even better week.
Thanks, everybody. All the questions that we did not address during this call, we will go ahead and send out in the follow-up materials. So again, thanks for your participation, and we'll be in touch soon.
Bye, everyone.